Now we're going to talk about the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. This is an era in which the cultural and intellectual forces in Western Europe emphasized reason, analysis, and individualism instead of traditional lines of authority. It was promoted by local thinkers in urban coffee houses, salons, and lodges, and it challenged the authority of institutions that were deeply rooted in society. Institutions like the Catholic Church, absolute monarchy. And the big idea is that people are talking about how they can reform society. Here's the terms. As always, make sure you write them down or print them out as we will be talking about them. Here's a map of Europe during this period of time we're talking about, just so you can get your bearings and see the areas we're talking about. And this movement, the Enlightenment, that we're going to talk about, begins in France. It will, however, spread to the rest of Europe, including England and even over to Russia. Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher, and he wrote that, quote, "Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed inability to use his own understanding without guidance from church, prince, or emperor." So think about what he's saying. He's talking about the main idea of the Enlightenment. It's the idea that you can think for yourself. You don't have to be dependent on what the church, the ruler, government, so forth tells you. You can use your own reason to make determinations for yourself. So the Enlightenment was the most important intellectual movement of the 18th century. It was a new way of thinking based on reason and liberty, and it will go on to inspire both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. It helps to shape our modern world. Two of the legacies of the Enlightenment are religious toleration and civil liberty. So how does the Enlightenment begin? Well, the beginning came with this guy, François-Marie Arouet, also known as Voltaire. He was a Frenchman, and he actually went by the name Voltaire because he just had a lot of disagreements with his family. He didn't get along with his father, and so he ended up kind of turning his back on them and his family name and going by another name, Voltaire. And as I said, he was a Frenchman, and he ends up going to England, where he lives for 2 years. And when he returns, he writes a book, Philosophical Letters Concerning the English Nation, published in 1734. This book describes his experiences with the English people and how superior they were to the French, in his opinion. He demonstrates the superiority of the British government and society through a series of philosophical letters. So why does he admire England? He admires England because it's a land of many faiths. Even though there was a state religion, the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, it was a land of religious toleration. People in England were not held under the control of a corrupt clergy. In England, people were valued based on their contribution to society. They were valued based on their merits, not their name. In France, you were valued based on your position in society, which you had by virtue of birth. So it's nothing you've earned. The British people were open to new ideas. They looked up to philosophers and poets and scientists and so forth, rather than fearing them and their ideas. Britain had a representative government. He felt that the influence of the king made Britain far superior to continental Europe. There, the people were free, living under a representative government. The House of Commons represented their interests. In France, the people were trapped under the power of an absolute monarch. Britain had succeeded in controlling the power of the king. He believed the Revolution of 1688 was the moment when the British people became free, while the French remained enslaved. Only in England, he believed, did men think free and noble thoughts. So he writes this book, publishes it, it becomes a bestseller, but it's also banned and publicly burned in France for the opinions it held. He was considered an outlaw for making the sort of criticisms he was making, and he ends up fleeing Paris to a spot near the French border, and then later moves to Switzerland, seeking freedom to write and publish his works. But Voltaire and his book ignited an entire philosophical movement which spread throughout Europe. Émilie du Châtelet is an example of a woman who was involved in the Enlightenment, because in this movement we're going to see that it's not just the men participating. She also played another role. She was supporting Voltaire. They were having an affair. She was wealthy. So he was basically a kept man. She paid for him for his living expenses so that he could spend his time writing and thinking. And she wasn't his only mistress. He had quite a few mistresses, actually. One of his mistresses was his niece, and another one of his mistresses was actually married with 3 kids and a husband. The husband knew about the affair and actually visited Voltaire when he was with the husband's wife quite often. And just a few other facts about Voltaire. He was imprisoned in the Bastille, which is a political prison in Paris. He was imprisoned in the Bastille for nearly a year for writing poems that mocked the royal family, and this was before he went to England. And he also became hugely wealthy in his own right, because he and a friend figured out a loophole in the French lottery, and they used that and made a fortune, made a bundle. And he even had a brief career as a spy for the French government. So this is a guy that was pretty well-rounded. So Voltaire and his book ignited an entire philosophical movement which spread throughout Europe. In France, the Enlightenment leaders were peopled by the anti-establishment individuals. In Scotland and Germany, the Enlightenment was a university movement peopled by professors. In Russia, the movement was taken up by kings and queens, the ultimate expression of the establishment. During this time period, a group of people known by the French term philosophes emerged. They were the male and female writers and thinkers who raised philosophical questions about man, nature, politics, and society. They were the intellectuals of the Enlightenment. Not all of them were French. Few of them were philosophers in the strict sense of the word, but they were literary people, professors, journalists, statesmen, and economists, political scientists, and above all, social reformers. They came from both the nobility and the middle class, and there were even a few who had lower origins. Above all, what they did was they criticized social injustice and abuse of power, and they promoted humanitarian reform. Basically, they believed that everything was open to question. They believed that people must question all existing values, institutions, morals, and so forth. One common bond that they all had was that they were heavily influenced by the scientific revolution. And this refers to the birth of modern science and the scientific method, a way of looking at the world based on experimentation, direct observation of nature, and mathematical reasoning. The scientific revolution was the cornerstone of the Enlightenment. It gave us our modern world view and provided a new way of thinking. In the past, there wasn't a lot of investigation of the natural world. The people and scientists relied on information left by the ancient Greeks and Romans. They also relied heavily on church doctrine. They looked at doctrine and the Bible and accepted it all as truth. They did not question. While during the Renaissance, philosophy, and especially that of the Greek philosopher Plato, was being rediscovered. Plato always insisted that the reality we saw was not the truth. There was a world of forms beyond our perceptions. Real knowledge, he said, was gained only through intense effort, especially mathematics. Now, in the years following the Renaissance, new and contemporary interpretations of Plato and his ideas were firing scientists to get to the truth of what is not immediately visible to the eye. They now had a desire to find the laws of truth that lie beyond our immediate perceptions. So, a new scientific worldview emerged, which questioned and reordered all knowledge and certainty. It challenged theology, intuition, and common sense. So here you see a salon, and this is where the philosophers would meet. Sometimes it was in the homes of people, nobility or whatnot. Sometimes it was in clubs. But they would come together and they would talk about these new ideas. They would share ideas and have intellectual discourse. And women actually played a very important part in the salons. Quite often they were the ones operating the salons. But it's thanks to these places that the ideas of the Enlightenment were able to grow and to spread. Sir Isaac Newton was an English mathematician, physicist, and astronomer. He used the scientific method to discover the laws of gravity and motion. He argued that the universe was orderly, predictable, and precise. He believed that mechanical laws governing stars and planets make our universe precise like a clock. The philosophers wanted to take the scientific method and apply it to humans. They argued that humans, through critical reasoning, could discover critical laws governing human society. So the philosophers tried to find natural laws. Building on the scientific revolution, they argued that traditions and institutions that did not stand up to the scientific method should be thrown out. Just get rid of them. John Locke was a British thinker, and he wrote Essay on Human Understanding. In this, he described his theory of learning. It said that humans were not born with innate ideas. Instead, at birth, the human mind was a blank slate. But over time, the human mind grows and stretches and learns through perceptions, experiences, and so on to acquire knowledge. A good environment and good institutions would provide good citizens. That's what Locke believed. Well, a lot of the progressive movements to come were based on Locke's ideas. And since many philosophers came from England, they felt that the English form of government was a good model. They believed the Bill of Rights was the wave of the future. Eventually, all nations would have their own. The philosophers had confidence in the power of the human mind to know the world through the use of reason. They felt that all individuals share fundamental natural rights, which governments have to protect. That's a core belief of the philosophers. Among the humane principles they lived by was the desire to reform society. They also believed in progress. They believed in religious toleration, civil liberty, constitutional government, and a social order based on talent and merit over aristocratic birth and privilege. They associated reform and progress with open intellectual dialogue and discourse. As I mentioned before, one of the great thinkers among the philosophers was Voltaire. He was the celebrity of the Age of Reason. He had the sharpest wit and mind of his era. He was the most prolific of them all. He wrote more than 100 volumes. And he was a huge fan of Locke, Newton, and constitutional government. He was also a relentless critic of the Catholic Church. He criticized their control and power, their censorship, corruption, and so forth. He was a critic of institutional, organized religion, especially intolerance and persecution. But he was not an atheist. He was a deist. So what is deism? Well, deists accepted the existence of God, but they did not believe God interfered in the events of the world. They compared God to a watchmaker. He created the world, set it in motion, then let it go. He got us going and then left us alone. We require no active intervention to keep us going. God created natural laws, like the clock pendulum, to keep us going, and then stepped back to allow the natural laws to do their job, to operate on their own. Well, if you think about it, this is a view that can land you in a lot of trouble with the institutional church. What's the use of clergy and the rituals of the church if you don't need them? Deists opposed the control the church had over people's minds. Part of the reasoning behind this was that in the 18th century, the church was the leading educator. The philosophes believed that the church controlled people's minds through sermons on Sunday and through education during the week. This is how people were enslaved and placed in chains, according to the Enlightenment thinkers. They believed that any religion could be good so long as it promoted tolerance and acceptance. So deists attacked the structures and dogmas of institutional churches in order to save the moral essence of Christianity and the moral teachings of Jesus. Voltaire's name became synonymous with human rights in the 18th century. He spoke out for freedom of speech, the abolition of slavery, the abolition of torture for prisoners, among other things. So, one of his greatest works is a book called Candide. And this is the story of a young man who is raised in seclusion pretty much in what he believes to be and what he's told is the best of all possible worlds. And then he goes out into the world and he encounters all sorts of hardships and horrors. But even though he's faced with the reality that this is not the best of all possible worlds, he refuses to accept that because his teacher, Dr. Pangloss, had always taught him this is the best of all possible worlds. So he does not question. And that's one of the things the philosophes criticize, the fact that people did not question what was evident before them. And so in this book, Voltaire attacks social injustices and the fuzzy thinking that rationalizes them. He criticizes the oppressiveness of many of the political systems of Europe and the New World. He uses satire and skepticism to poke fun at many of the ideas that were prevalent during the time. So let's look at political thought now, starting with Baron Montesquieu. He was a French writer, thinker, and philosophe. His ideas contributed to the separation of powers in government. He wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws, and in it he outlined a form of government with separate branches, 3 branches to be exact. He felt that these would ideally balance and check each other. His beliefs and ideas are going to be very important to us because they will later influence the framing of the United States Constitution. Another great thinker was the Frenchman Rousseau. In 1762, he wrote The Social Contract, and in it, he argued that reason and emotion were equally important in order to gain knowledge. Both were necessary. The social contract tries to reconcile individual freedom with the general good of the community. He argued that through a social contract, individuals agree to give up individual liberties for the larger purpose of the community. He said that the general will was always right because it represented the entire community, and we as citizens are obliged to obey the general will. Now, one question Rousseau never answered was who interpreted or defined the general will. But he believed that individual citizens retain their freedom and equality only by obeying the general will. Some people regard the social contract as the basis of democracy. Others see it differently. Others see it as a rationale for a dictatorial government, for example, forcing people into freedom. So, one thing you can think about is, to what extent can oppression and force be used to coerce people into certain beliefs? In the area of economics, one of the great names was Adam Smith. In 1776, he wrote a book called Wealth of Nations, and in it he defended free trade and free enterprise. He believed in the concept of laissez-faire. This is the idea that the government should stay out of the laws of supply and demand. There should be no interference by the government. This idea becomes the economic rationale for capitalism. Smith said the laws of supply and demand would operate on their own and would promote the greatest wealth for the greatest number of people, if the government stays out. If this is accomplished, all would be well. So again, this is the basis for capitalism. In the area of prison reform, we have an Italian man named Beccaria. He wrote on crime and punishment and dedicated himself to prison reform. He condemned torture, believing it to be inhumane. He said criminal proceedings should be fair and honest, and the punishment should fit the crime. He believed that the only reason for punishment was to deter future crime. He also felt that it was to the greater good to return people to a useful place in society rather than to let them suffer and die in prison. Well, he's important because his ideas would inspire future codes, which in turn inspired reform. In the area of women's rights, we have an Englishwoman, Mary Wollstonecraft. She supported equal rights and opportunities for women. She believed that families and societies alike would benefit from well-educated, self-sufficient women. In 1792, her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, was published. This is considered to be the first great feminist treatise. Wollstonecraft preached that intellect will always govern, and she sought to, quote, persuade women to endeavor to acquire strength both of mind and body, and to convince them that the soft phrases, susceptibility of heart, delicacy of sentiment, and refinement of taste are almost synonymous with epithets of weakness, end quote. Well, perhaps inspired by her mother's feminist beliefs, her daughter went on to write one of the great horror classics of all time. Her daughter was Mary Shelley, and the book was Frankenstein. The philosophes used the written word to spread their ideas. An example of that is Denis Diderot. He compiled and edited a 38-volume encyclopedia. He argued that his encyclopedia would bring together all the knowledge in the world. The articles focused on the practical applications of knowledge. He also criticized what he saw as being wrong with society. And so you had philosophes all contributing articles to this thing. And the encyclopedia was an attempt by the philosophes to destroy ignorance, unreason, and superstition. It was a systematic effort to share the new Enlightenment view with everyone. Well, French authorities felt that he was corrupting morals and obstructing royal authority, but he persevered. And it turns out that the encyclopedia will be banned in France, and Diderot has a hard time getting it published. It will finally be published thanks to Catherine the Great, the Tsarina of Russia, and she helped to subsidize the thing so that it could be published in the end. The Renaissance produced a new confidence in human intelligence and a curiosity about the world. The scientific revolution produced a new method of studying the world based on observation and experiment. The writers of the Enlightenment attempted to combine Renaissance curiosity with the scientific method to study and improve society. The Enlightenment provided a new vision, a new way of thinking. It placed a new emphasis on the self and a movement away from the burden of tradition. There was a new emphasis on the human condition. Enlightenment thinkers believed that progress was both possible and desirable. They thought that progress would lead to greater liberty and human happiness. Alexander Pope said, "Know thyself. The proper study of God is mankind." And that is what the Enlightenment was all about. And so here you see on this slide the key ideas of the Enlightenment. Discover by reason and experience the natural laws that should operate in any situation. Remove obstacles to their operation, and the result will be progress toward happiness and freedom. And then I broke it down for you. Reason, natural laws, progress, happiness, freedom. And here are some quotes by some of the philosophers that can give you a little glimpse into some of their beliefs. Voltaire, who defended free speech, supposedly said, "I disapprove of what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it." And then Rousseau, "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains." So think about what those chains might be. Chains like institutional religion, organized government, and so forth, absolute monarchies. John Locke, "The mind is a blank slate." And again, his belief was that we're not born with innate ideas, but if we are raised, if we grow up in a good environment, our mind will fill with good ideas, good memories, good thoughts, and the result will be good citizens. And another, also going along with free speech, "The individual who persecutes another because he is not of the same opinion is nothing less than a monster," by Voltaire. And Descartes. And this right here is one of the main ideas of the Enlightenment. I think, therefore I am. Continuing with the idea of the Enlightenment, we're going to talk about something called enlightened despotism. How do these new ideas affect society and politics? What did the kings and queens of Europe think about the ideas of the philosophers? That is what we're going to focus on. So as always, here are the terms. Make sure you get them and then listen for them as we move forward. So here you see a map of Europe in the 18th century, the period of time we're focusing on. And we're going to focus on 3 countries. Over in the Far East, we have Russia, the big green country. In the center, we have the Austrian Empire, that area that's kind of like a dark blue. And then we're going to look at Prussia, just to the north of the Austrian Empire, in brown. So what did the kings and queens of Europe think about the ideas of the philosophers? Well, the French king, Louis XV, liked to be entertained, but not enlightened. He was openly hostile to the philosophers and often ordered their writings censored. Other monarchs, though, were enchanted by the new ideas about reason and progress. Several rulers conducted scientific experiments, played musical instruments, dabbled at poetry, read books on philosophy, and corresponded with Voltaire. They ruled according to the principles of enlightened despotism. These principles, the philosophers believed, included favoring religious toleration or tolerance, making economic and legal reforms, and justifying their rule by its usefulness to society rather than by divine right. The philosophes believed the best way to implement change in society was through a benevolent or enlightened monarch, and that is the theory behind enlightened despotism. But think for a moment. How is enlightened despotism a contradiction in terms? Well, enlightened means education, open to new ideas. Despotism, on the other hand, means oppression, much like a dictatorship. So with these monarchs we're going to look at, we see that as despots, they were absolute rulers, in control of all the powers of government. As enlightened despots, they were absolute rulers who supposedly used their great power for the good of the people they ruled. I'm going to talk about 3 monarchs who all experimented with enlightened reforms, but their policies were often despotic and tyrannical. They tended to use enlightened concepts as a means to increase state power to wage war and expansion. They also used the power of the state to implement reform based on enlightened ideas. So, enlightened despotism is a contradiction in terms. All 3 of these monarchs we'll talk about waged wars, a lot of them, in Europe. Because of their military triumphs and territorial expansion, their countries, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, emerged as great powers. In the 18th century, Prussia consisted of scattered territories which needed to be united. Austria needed policies to help control its huge territory and tie various groups together. Russia at the time was bordered by Poland, and border wars became a reality for all of these countries. By 1790, there will be no more Poland. Because of expanded frontiers, Poland is gone, most of the territory going to Russia. Let's look at Prussia. This was the future nucleus of the Kingdom of Germany. It consisted of pieces of scattered territories, all ruled by a king in Berlin, and it was very vulnerable to attack. The goal was to create a unified frontier. Frederick II, also known as Frederick the Great, was the ruler of Prussia. An interesting story about Frederick is that he never got along with his father. His father was Frederick William I, very militaristic, and he wanted to beat those values into his son. But Frederick II, even though he grew up in a military atmosphere and recognized that the military warfare was necessary, he was much more interested in cultural things, art, music, literature, and so forth. And so his father always thought he was weak, and the two never got along. And a funny story about his father, Frederick William I, he was fascinated with the military, and especially with a special regiment that he created. When Frederick William I became king, he reduced the size of the royal guard to a single regiment, a regiment of soldiers who were very, very tall. They were called the Potsdam Giants, and they ranged in size from 6'2" to 7'2". And, you know, for the 18th century, even 6 feet was very, very tall. And he would try to get men to enlist voluntarily, but if they would not, he would kidnap them, have them kidnapped off the streets all over Europe. Other monarchs, such as Peter the Great, would actually give him tall men, tall soldiers as gifts. And one famous story is of a carpenter from Scotland who was 7 foot something, who was on his way home from work one night in Edinburgh, and he never made it home. Well, that was because he was kidnapped off the street and sent to Frederick William I. So the king in Prussia gets this gift, this box. He opens it, and out falls a dead 7 foot something carpenter. they had forgotten to put air holes or water in for him. But this was the norm. And Frederick William I was so into this that he even ordered these men to marry tall women, and forced tall women to marry tall men, so that they could breed more tall boys for his regiment. He trained and drilled them every day, and often just as entertainment, like when he was sick in bed sometimes, he would order them to march before him. Well, when he died in 1740, there were 3,200 soldiers in this regiment. And I will say that they never saw combat. When his son, Frederick II, Frederick the Great, became king, he didn't see any use for this, and so he disbanded it. And even though he didn't love the military as much as his father and grandfather, he did, as I said, saw the necessity for it. He recognized that Prussia, because of its geographic location, because it consisted of scattered territories, needed to unify itself, needed to expand, and that warfare was necessary for that. He also did a lot of good things for his country. He strengthened and built up the army. He fortified the boundaries of his country. And he unified the territories. Here's a couple of other facts about Frederick. Even before he became king, when he was the crown prince in 1730, he had attempted to flee to Britain while on a trip, partly because of his continuing disagreements with his father. Well, he had a friend with him. The plan failed, and his father was furious. So his father had him hauled back, imprisoned him, and then forced him to watch his accomplices beheading. So that gives you a little idea, a little glimpse into Frederick and his relationship with his father. Ultimately, he is going to transform Prussia from a German kingdom to a great European power, though. Frederick does many great things for Prussia. He also, however, involved Prussia in a decade-long war with Austria over Silesia, a territory that was valuable for her size and resources. In the end, Silesia was conquered by Frederick. Frederick considered himself an enlightened monarch. So what were some of his enlightened measures? Well, he did attempt reforms. For example, he supported religious toleration and invited foreign settlement into his land. French Protestants fled persecution in France for safety and acceptance in Prussia, as did many other groups. So when many of those Huguenots were fleeing France, they headed to Prussia. He upgraded education at all levels. The reason for this was to train better officers and officials. He stimulated agrarian and economic growth in order to make the army self-sufficient in its resources. He made the state bureaucracy more efficient by reorganizing it. He introduced a new law code to improve the judicial system. So, as you can see, he at least attempted to make some reforms in his country. Frederick was the celebrity among the philosophes. He wrote poetry, composed music, wrote philosophical tracts, played the flute, and one of his friends with whom he corresponded was Voltaire. Voltaire regularly visited Frederick. They corresponded regularly. Voltaire visited. In fact, at one point, Voltaire stayed for 3 years in Frederick's summer palace. His summer palace was called Sanssouci, which meant without care. And it was outside Berlin, and this was Frederick's retreat. This is where he went to just get away from all the worries and pressures of being king. And here's where Voltaire stayed for 3 years. And this is one of the palaces in Europe that is modeled after Versailles. Even though he attempted to make some changes for the better, Frederick failed to alter the basic social hierarchy of Prussia. So was he truly an enlightened ruler? His opinions were generally liberal and humane, but his actions not always so much. For example, he granted religious freedom to Catholics and Protestants, but he discriminated against Polish and Russian Jews. So is that truly religious toleration? He reduced, but did not abolish, the use of torture in his kingdom. He did allow freedom of the press, and he admitted that serfdom was wrong. And serfdom was a practice started back in the early Middle Ages, whereby peasants were basically locked into this relationship with the nobility, and they were little more than slaves in many cases, because they had so many requirements on them, all the labor they had to give and so forth, that they could never truly have freedom. And he admitted that serfdom was wrong, but he did nothing to end it, because he needed the support of the landowners. The Prussian officers were recruited from the Junkers, and these were the aristocratic landowners. They had a lot of social and economic privileges that they were given in return for their service. The peasants, or the serfs, on the other hand, worked the fields and fought the wars. And this social hierarchy, with the Junkers at the top, the serfs below, defined Prussian social power. What Frederick realized was that if he were to free the serfs, the Junkers would lose their labor force, and he in turn would lose the support of the Junkers. He was not willing to do that. Perhaps Frederick's most important contribution was his attitude toward being king. Frederick called himself the first servant of the state. From the beginning of his reign, he made it very clear that his goal was to serve and strengthen his country. And you can contrast that to Louis XIV, whose idea was, I am the state. So Frederick is saying, I am here to serve you. I am here to make your lives better. And that's an attitude that clearly appealed to the philosophes. In Austria, or the Habsburg Empire, we see another enlightened monarch at work, and this is Joseph II. Austria was just this big mosaic of lands and peoples, each with their own unique traditions and local autonomy. This was an empire that had been created through warfare and treaties, and the result was that there were people of many different cultural backgrounds living within the boundaries of the empire. There were Czechs, Hungarians, Croatians, Italians, and Germans, and many more. A lot of this territory had been won in the War of Spanish Succession in the early 18th century. What held the empire together was the fact that the Austrian, Hungarian, and Bohemian crowns were all worn by the same ruler, a member of the Habsburg family. So Joseph comes to the throne, and one of his goals was to overcome regional identities by building a strong central government. He was determined to introduce enlightened policies, and he was perhaps the most sincere of the enlightened despots. Now, originally, he ruled as a co-ruler with his mother, and then when she passed away, he ruled on his own as a full-fledged ruler. And he was very sincere. For example, he gave his large inheritance to ease the national debt, and he ordered that his brother do the same thing. He cut government spending. He built the first truly public parks and charged the church with caring for the sick and the destitute. He viewed it as his duty as an absolute monarch to protect and serve his nation and all his people, regardless of their religion or class. He also loved music, and his nickname was the Musical King, because of his support of musicians such as Mozart. It's thanks to Joseph II that Mozart was able to grow into a great musician, and thanks to him that we are able to benefit from his work. And also, we'll be talking about the French Revolution and the French Queen, Marie Antoinette. She was the sister of Joseph II. So what else did Joseph do? Well, he tried to centralize the government and administration. The problem was that in doing that, he alienated key provinces, especially Hungary, and these were provinces he needed for wars. He tried to make German the official language of the government and official affairs. This is something known as linguistic imperialism, and it stirred resentment and opposition from many of the non-German speaking people. They wanted their own language to have equal status. Plus, a lot of his subjects were afraid that linguistic discrimination would mean cultural discrimination. He also believed in and supported religious toleration. He made it official. In 1781, he introduced religious toleration in the empire through the Patent of Tolerance. He also tried to secularize church properties and put them under state control. This gave him extra revenue, but it alienated the Pope and most of the Catholic Church hierarchy. These were people who had been huge supporters of the Habsburgs. In fact, the Catholic Church itself had been one of the key support groups for his dynasty, and now he loses much of that support. He wanted to try to make taxation more fair. The nobility didn't pay the same taxes as did those at the bottom of society, so he decided to tax them. And when he taxed the nobility, he alienated them. He wanted to reduce the labor requirement of the peasants. By doing this, he threatened to undermine the bond between the aristocracy and the monarchy. Same problem Frederick had. In areas of education and culture, he was a great patron, giving his patronage, that means his financial support, to Mozart and others. And he also expanded the school system. One of his great legacies was that through his efforts, the University of Vienna was transformed into one of Europe's leading institutions in medicine. Unfortunately, his other social and political reforms did not last. Well, how about Russia? In Russia, we see Catherine the Great ruling from 1762 to 1796. And what's interesting is she was not even Russian. She had been born the daughter of a relatively unimportant German prince in 1729. When she was only 15, she was sent to the Russian court at St. Petersburg to be married to the heir to the Russian throne, the Grand Duke Peter. At the time, Peter the Great's daughter Elizabeth was the ruler of Russia. And the Grand Duke, Peter, who Catherine was to wed, was Elizabeth's nephew. So here you see the Russian Empire to the east, the large green area. And Russia at that time was the largest of the European states, but also in some respects still lagged behind many other European countries. So here you see the Grand Duke Peter, the husband of Catherine the Great. Peter was mentally unstable. His chief pleasure was playing with his toy soldiers. Even after he was king, he would sit by the end of his bed and play with these soldiers. Another favorite pastime was tormenting his dogs. Well, he came to the throne in January of 1762, and he immediately began to alienate people. For example, he alienated the nobility when he passed a series of reforms designed to improve the lives of the poor. He also removed Russia from an ongoing war with Prussia, and this was an action that proved to be very unpopular with the military nobility. So what happens is, he comes to the throne in January. In the months to follow, he's losing the support of pretty much everybody. And in July of 1762, after just 6 months on the throne, he abdicated. He stepped down. And he ended up within 10 days being murdered by an officer who just happened to be the brother of Catherine's current love affair. So many people believe that she was behind the murder. It was never proven, but she certainly did benefit from it, because she becomes the new ruler of Russia. In September 1762, Catherine was crowned Catherine II of Russia, beginning a reign that lasted 34 years. At that time, she reigned in a man's world. Most of the male rulers of the time attributed her success to her gender and to the sexual favors they were sure she provided. And while she may have done this, she was also a very capable, shrewd opportunist who exploited any opportunity to enhance Russia and its reputation. She tried to emulate Peter the Great and tried to continue the process he started of transforming Russia into a great power, using enlightened concepts to enhance her power. So what does she do? Well, she founded a city called Odessa, a black seaport. It became a thriving cosmopolitan area, which brought in a lot of trade and activity. She was an enormous builder who built many palaces and monuments in St. Petersburg, which became known as the Venice of the North. She had one of the best art collections in Europe at that time, and she used her private art collection for the good of her country. It became the foundation for the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Her collection included paintings by Rembrandt and Raphael, as well as many other great artists of the Renaissance and beyond. And here you see the interior of the Hermitage, today one of the world's leading art museums. Catherine used ideas to try to enlighten Russia. For example, she helped subsidize Diderot's encyclopedia. She also invited philosophes to come to Russia, and her reform initiatives inspired many philosophes. But, in spite of her sympathy for enlightened ideas, Catherine did little to actually improve the life of the peasants in her empire. Her actual record indicates some critical shortcomings as an enlightened ruler. For example, in 1766, the Instruction was published. This was meant to be a blueprint for reforms, such as the abolition of torture. She was also going to free the serfs. It was a new law code for Russia, and it's considered to be one of the great liberal documents of the 18th century. In fact, it was so liberal that it was banned in France. But much of the reform remained on paper. Catherine became occupied with other state affairs, mainly war. And sadly, she did not produce any concrete reforms in her lifetime. Catherine put down more than a dozen revolts during her reign, and one of the largest was the Pugachev revolt in 1773, which bled into the next year. This was the largest peasant revolt in 18th century Europe. The uprising consisted of Russian serfs, soldiers, and escaped prisoners. The leader of the rebellion was a soldier named Pugachev, and he claimed to be the dead Peter, her dead husband. When Pugachev promised to end serfdom, the revolt just spread like wildfire all throughout Russia. And Catherine was terrified because she saw this thing getting out of control. So she called her army in, said, "Do whatever you have to do to put this rebellion down." And with a lot of brutality, they crushed it. Her soldiers destroyed entire villages. Pugachev was captured and brought in an iron cage to Moscow to be executed. And after this rebellion, Catherine reevaluated, and she decided that she could not keep her throne without the support of the nobles. So she dropped her plans for ending serfdom, and she gave the nobles absolute control over the serfs. So the Russian serfs lost their last traces of freedom. By the end of Catherine's reign, nearly 95% of Russia's people toiled as serfs for the all-powerful landlords. Another shortcoming was her treatment of intellectual protest and public opinion. She legalized printing presses. That's a good thing. But they were censored. She oppressed social and political criticism when she was criticized. No one was allowed to speak out against her. She used arrest, exile, and censorship to deal with her critics. She also ignored the philosophers' arguments against war. She waged war relentlessly against Russia's southern neighbor, the Ottoman Turks. She sought access to the Black Sea. In 1783, her armies won the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea. Her conquests of Turkish territory, though, threatened the delicate balance of power in Eastern Europe. The rulers of Austria and Prussia were both afraid that Russia might grab the strategic straits leading to the Mediterranean Sea, and so end result, a lot of warfare. Well, here's some other just interesting facts about Catherine. She had many, many affairs during her lifetime, and it was rumored that none of her 4 children were actually fathered by her husband. It was actually known that 2 of them at least did not have the same father. She also had a list of very interesting rules. 1. You had to speak quietly and moderately, no matter where you were. 2nd, an argument must be without anger or passion. It's hard to do sometimes. 3, there was a rule against sighing, yawning, and boring people. Then, there was a rule that you had to be willing to participate in any games that were suggested. And finally, there was a rule against drinking so much that you could not leave under your own power. That's not a bad rule. So, what were the limitations of enlightened despotism? Well, no matter how educated and reform-minded individuals were, they could not do it alone. They still had to deal with the nobility, ignorance, poverty of the masses, and so on. For example, Catherine, Frederick, and Joseph all wanted to free the serfs, but then realized that in doing so, they would lose the support of the nobility, and they needed the support of the nobility in order to rule. It failed because even these enlightened monarchs pursued traditional state interests, such as war, expansion, and empire. They were called the Great not because of any long-lasting reforms, but because of their military victories. I want to add something about the limitations of enlightened despotism. In 1773, Denis Diderot, who published the encyclopedia, visited Catherine. Catherine agreed with his theories, but disagreed with his suggestions for specific political reforms. And years later, here's what she wrote. "If I had believed him, everything would have been turned upside down in my kingdom. Legislation, administration, finance, all would have been turned topsy-turvy to make room for impractical theories. Then, speaking openly to him, I said, 'Monsieur Diderot, with all your high principles, one would make fine books, but very bad business. You work only upon paper, which endures all things, but I, poor empress as I am, work on the human skin, which is irritable and ticklish to a different degree. So what she's saying is that, yeah, these ideas sound great when you write them down, but actually implementing them with real people is a very different thing, because you have to deal with the realities of life, such as I mentioned before, the idea that if you free the serfs, you lose the support of a key group of people. And to give you an idea of just the greed and the quest for power and land that we see with these monarchs, we have the partitions of Poland. Between 1772 and 1795, Poland was partitioned or divided up between these monarchs. This symbolized the greed, opportunism, and imperialism of the Enlightened monarchs. They wanted land, and the idea was, well, maybe instead of going to war against each other, we can just take the land from somewhere else. Frederick proposed that the three powerful countries, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, should take chunks of territory from the weak kingdom of Poland, instead of fighting a costly war over Turkish lands. The others agreed, and in 1772 each took a generous slice of Poland and sent troops to occupy it. Poland's wishes were ignored, and this flagrant land grab was known as the First Partition of Poland. There will be two later partitions, both suggested by Catherine. In 1793, Russia and Prussia both took more of Poland's land, and then 2 years later, in 1795, the three greedy neighbors took the rest. The result? On the map of Europe, Poland no longer existed. It did not appear again as an independent country until after World War I in the 20th century. So, these monarchs failed to alter institutions, but they did contribute in the long run to the spread of human rights issues. At the end of her remarkable reign, Catherine the Great wrote the epitaph for her own tomb, and it is something that might apply to all these enlightened monarchs. She wrote, "Enthroned in Russia, she desired nothing but the best for her country, and tried to procure for her subjects happiness, liberty, and wealth. She forgave easily and hated no one." So that's the quote that she wrote for her epitaph. In my opinion, she exaggerated only a little.